No, wait, why did you ask me if I read Mikey and the Dragons? Why would I read it?
Oh,
I mean,
well, just because if I refer to it, I don't want to say like, oh, well, you know the part that says this, and you're like, no, actually, because I didn't
first
read
of
it.
all, I can't believe that you actually could accuse me, a former national news anchor, of not preparing for my interview, because that's what it sounds like. Don't worry, I read the book last night to myself and look at these nice Post-its that I took.
Oh, you look like that's what my books look like when I
Yeah.
record a podcast.
Maybe that can be your next product, is Jocko Post-its, since you've really expanded your product line.
You never know.
I know. I thought that sounded good. You gave me 2 photos of a young Jocko Willink. Describe a young Jocko Willink. What was he like?
I would say at the young age photos that I sent you, I was pretty, pretty much an average kid. I was pretty much an average American kid. I played the average American sports. I played soccer. I played basketball. I just kind of did normal things. But it was when I got a little bit older is where I got a little bit more rebellious, and that started to creep out a little bit. So,
In what way exactly?
I was just rebellious, rebellious against my parents, rebellious against the school, rebellious against authority in general.
So,
Kind
I
of your
mean,
typical.
does that mean running away? Does that mean talking back to your parents? Does that mean running with the wrong crowd? All of the above?
All of the above.
No way.
Yeah.
You were a bad kid.
Yeah, I was not a great kid, for sure. For sure. And as I've gotten older, and one thing that I try and explain to kids is that when you turn 18, you have to leave your house, and you have to leave the comfort of your parents. And you recognize that at a younger age, and you don't really know how to prepare for it. So what you do, I think, subconsciously, is you start to distance yourself from your parents because you know you're going to have to separate yourself. So you distance yourself by being rebellious, and then when you're 18, you're a little bit more prepared for it. Whereas if you were just latched onto your parents your whole childhood, when it's time to leave, it would be too disruptive for you. So I think that's part of it. And I think I know, I mean, from my kids, I've seen my kids do various amounts of rebellion, and so I know it is something that all kids go through. And I mean, there's whole books and movies and myths about teenage rebellion. So it's a real thing. And I definitely was a rebellious young teenager, and I was always rebellious. I was rebellious even when I was in the Navy. I was rebellious in my own, special way. I found ways to rebel. So yeah, I was a pretty rebellious kid.
And so some of the books that you've written, Way of the Warrior Kid, really apply to kids from a young age, but all the way really through their teenage years. And then your other books sort of pick up from that point on. But this book, in many ways, is geared towards a younger child, like we saw in your photos. And I would say, what were you gearing it towards? A toddler to like 7 years old, 8, 9? Were you kind of thinking that range?
Yeah, and it's weird because as I wrote the book, I definitely was aiming it towards a younger crowd, and because Way of the Warrior Kid is a longer book, and it can be read by a kid, but it's a harder read for a kid. And I wanted this book to be really appealing to kids and wanted kids to want to listen to it. And so yeah, I would say I aimed it at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old.
Yeah.
Something like that.
And it's great because it's all in a rhyme, so it's easy to read. And you're really tackling a question for young Mikey, which is something that he fears. He has a lot of fears, actually. Did you have a lot of fears when you were a little kid? You said you were an average American kid. What did you fear most?
I had every fear that every kid or most kids have. And every kid's scared of something. When I talk about bullying, I always say that you're going to get bullied. Because even if you're the biggest 10-year-old, even if you're a massive 10-year-old, there's a 13-year-old that's even bigger than you, and he's going to bully you. And if you're the massive 13-year-old, there's a 15-year-old that's going to bully you. So you're going to get bullied, and you're going to be afraid of things. You're going to be afraid of the unknown. And just like every other kid, as I was a little kid, I was scared of normal things that kids are scared of. I was scared of the dark. I was scared of the monsters. I was scared of water. I was scared, just like a normal kid, and had to overcome those fears. And that's kind of where And, I see that with my own kids. And I think one thing that happened to me with my own kids is, in my job when I was in the military, it was always like, oh, well, what's going on in my world, because I'm in the military and it's really important and it's really big and I have real big things to contend with. And, oh, I wish I could be a little kid, because little kids, they don't, I'd be looking at my kids saying, oh, you don't know how lucky you have it because you're just a little kid. You don't have to contend with anything fierce in the world. And what I realized as I saw my kids, and I didn't actually say that to them, but I would think it, and I was wrong, because what I realized is that for kids, that is their world. And those things that they're afraid of are just as threatening to them as what threatens adults when we get older. And we have to learn to contend with our fears when we get older, but they have to learn to contend with those fears when they're younger. And that's why I talked about, this book. And I know we were talking about Jordan Peterson earlier, and, one of the things that he talks about with dragons is that dragons are sort of the consolidated fears of human beings, because they breathe fire, which humans are afraid of fires. We're afraid of monsters. We're afraid of being ripped apart. So they have giant teeth. They can fly, so we can't hide from them. They've got all these, in mythology, everyone's scared of snakes. So dragons have these, they have scales, so it's all these things kind of conglomerated together. And if you know how to contend with the fear of dragons, then you can figure out how to contend with the fear of other things in the world.
I don't want to give too much of the book away, but there's a nice twist about the dragons at the end that proves your point. But I think people should read it, because it surprised me reading the book about where it was going. I was a little worried about Mikey. Oh, well, and of course his other character that you introduce in all of it. Are you still scared of the dark, by the way? Do you have a nightlight that we should know about?
I am not scared of the dark. No, I am not scared of the dark. But I actually get asked, on the Warrior Kid podcast, I just answered the question again, which I always get I get probably 5 questions a week that are, how do I overcome fear of the dark? Mm-hmm. So I get that question all the time, and I answer it once every 5 or 6 podcasts, so I can spin it a little bit differently and answer it for little Jimmy or little Sarah or little Freddie, because they want to hear it, that I'm talking to them. So, but yeah, kids are scared of the dark. Why? Because you don't know what's in there.
You want to know who's not scared of the dark? My 2-year-old Liberty, who likes to hide herself in dark closets. She's not afraid of anything, that little. I mean, it's just, I don't know what to make of it. But you've met Liberty.
I have, yeah.
You could see that in her, I think.
Yeah. She's a bold young child.
Well, she's got the name. So you're getting these questions, I mean, what do you think is the key as a parent, but also, in your role now, to telling kids how to overcome their fear? What do you keep going back to?
You've got to face your fear. You've got to go on the offense. You've got to stand up and not hide from it. If you hide from what you're afraid of, you never find out what is behind it. And so that's the basic premise, is stand up and face your fear. And it's interesting too, because I've talked about this when we were in Iraq, the difference between being on offense and being on defense is a huge psychological difference. And it feels great to be on offense. It feels great to go and attack the problem. And it feels horrible when the problem is attacking you. And that's the same thing with fear. So if you're afraid of something and what you do is you hide from it and you don't face it, it is going to win. And yet, if you stand up and you face what it is, you're going to find out, as the prince finds out, that the things that they're afraid of aren't as big as they think they're going to be.
Aren't exactly what they seem. There's so many different nuances in the book, but since you mentioned being deployed to Iraq, I want to read this one section. There's a section in the book, and so you mentioned the prince. The prince gets introduced in the book. Little Mikey's reading a story about a prince. And in this story about the prince, so as a reader, you get sort of 2 stories in this book. You get the story of Mikey, but then you get the story of the prince, which is really cool. So it's a story within a story. But for this prince, the prince loses his father, and he opens up this chest and he finds a letter from his father. And so I want to read this part just to give people a little bit of the book, unless you have it memorized. Do you have it memorized, Jocko? Then you could just recite it. But
I do not have it memorized.
Okay, so then I'm going to read it. Part of this letter, and it's a great letter. I know that you think you don't know what to do, but remember that I was once a little boy too. I was also small and had fear in my heart, and I didn't even know where to start. I couldn't imagine going over the hill to face the dragons that wanted to kill, but don't worry, son, You will be just fine if you can keep these things in your mind. The dragons, they aren't really that big at all. It is only in our minds that we make them so tall. And I was curious about this. Did you ever write letters to your kids like this, Jocko? Was this modeled off of any letters that you've written your son or your daughters?
No, I had conversations with them like that, but I did not write them that type of note. And that's one of my favorite parts of the book is when the prince finds the note from his father and he opens it up and it says, "To my son."
Yes.
And I loved writing that part, and I loved reading it when I did the audio version of it. But no, I didn't write those letters to my kids, and I probably should have. I probably should have. I did not.
It made me think, it was one of the great parts of reading this book is thinking, sometimes I wonder about writing letters to my kids, and I get so overwhelmed about doing it because you have to think about, well, when they find a letter, why am I even doing it? But reading this reminded me, it doesn't have to be a long letter. It could just be a short letter for your children. And it's a great, I don't know if that was going to be one of the takeaway of the book, but for me as a parent, I really like that idea of it. And the letter is powerful.
So you just reminded me something. So I was going to tell you that in my life, if I write you a letter, then listen to what it says, because I only write letters to people when they need it. Mm-hmm. And that reminded me that I actually have written letters to my kids. And I actually read one of the letters that I wrote to one of my kids on my podcast. And it was a letter that I wrote to my oldest daughter. She was not getting along with my wife. My daughter was going through her little rebellious phase, and she was being hostile, and she was not treating my wife, her mom, with respect. And I realized, and so I said to myself, okay, I need to explain to my daughter. All my daughter thinks my wife is some woman that cleans up the house. And so I wrote a letter to my daughter that explained to her who my wife actually is, because my wife is an incredible woman who did all kinds of things. Before she married me, she traveled the world, she worked, she put herself through college, she worked in multiple jobs. And then once we were married, she gave all that up to take care of, our kids. And then when I was deployed overseas, she handled everything from broken water heaters to flat tires and all the kids running around and all the diapers and the throw up and everything else that comes with. And then she was going to visit my guys in the hospital that were wounded. She was going to my guys' funerals when we still weren't home from Iraq. And so I explained to her in a letter who her mom was and why she should respect her. And I've done the same thing with my other kids as well. But like I said, unfortunately, I guess it's unfortunate, I only write letters like that when people need them. Mm-hmm. And so for my kids, it's always been when my kids are veering off the path of righteousness and veering off the path of being good. And my kids, I don't keep my kids in a box. I don't keep them in a highly disciplined box where they're not allowed to deviate. I want my kids to make their own decisions. I want my kids to make mistakes. I want my kids to suffer consequences sometimes. But sometimes they get too far outside of the box, occasionally. And when they do, if they don't correct it pretty quickly, they're going to get a letter from me. And I do. I actually have those letters. And so, yes, I guess I was incorrect. I guess I never wrote unfortunately, I've never written a nice letter to my kids. And that's not cool.
Well, maybe nice, or it sounds like it's a significant letter. You've written several significant letters to your kids, and I'm sure they were impactful. Even just hearing about them, it sounds impactful. You forgot one really key part of the reasons why Helen is so cool, is that she deals with that alarm going off for whatever God's name hour in the morning on a regular basis.
One of the things
I can't even imagine. I think about Helen on almost every day when I see your watch. Like, does she need a separate room? Like, what's going?
One of the things that makes us very happily married is that she is a heavy sleeper and I am not. And so I have, and I've answered this question 1,000 times. How do you do it? How do you get up without bothering your wife? You get an escalating alarm that starts off very quietly. Now, if I was a heavy sleeper and she was a light sleeper, that would be problematic.
Well, I'm going to need some marriage intervention, because Leif's alarm goes off. It's like literally gives me a heart attack. And I don't mind getting up early, but I'm like, this is not going to work. It's not going to work. So I blame you for that. But I'm getting over it. So let me ask you this. You have talked in the past about when you were a little boy that you wanted to be a commando, that in your life that you had that vision for yourself, a goal in that way. But did you ever imagine yourself as a writer?
I was always telling stories. And at some point, and I listened to radio shows. And I know that sounds strange in this day and age, but when I was a kid, there were certain radio shows that I would listen to that were, I guess the word is theatrical shows on the radio, where people would do drama, and I would listen to them. People would tell stories. I would listen to them. And so I enjoyed telling stories when I was a kid. And I actually wrote some stories when I was a kid. Whether or not I am actually consider myself a writer right now, I'm still not sure. I don't really feel, if you were to ask me what do, I wouldn't say I was a writer.
What would you say?
I would say I'd probably have to give some kind of a longer explanation. You know what I would probably say is I'd probably say I've written some books. I'd probably say I've written some books. I talk on a podcast. I retired from the military. I have a leadership company, and I talk about leadership, and that's kind of what I do. But yeah, I still don't feel like a writer per se, which is weird because, Leif and I will go to New York, and that's the mecca of writing, and we'll be in our publishers talking to everyone, and they all talk about writing, and Leif and I are talking about, machine guns.
Which I can actually attest happens. Like that's not a lie. And then there's sound effects, and there's all these sort of descriptions, and that really does happen. So I can affirm that. But even though you don't think about yourself per se as a writer, how many best-selling books do you have at this point? Have all of them been bestsellers, Jocko?
Yeah, they have. And what's really cool and what I like the best is that the books, they're not just bestsellers, because there's a lot of bestsellers, and bestsellers, all that means is in the week that they got released, they sold a bunch of copies, they hit that mark, they had the publicity, and then that's it. It's over. And with all the books, starting with Extreme Ownership and the dichotomy of leadership and the Discipline Equals Freedom Field Manual, and both the kids book and this kid book coming out, they all sell all the time, continually, and that to me is a testament to an actual good book, because it's not just the people that saw the thing on the news and said, "Oh, I'll buy that book." That can get you the bestseller, but to sustain the sales is to me tells me that people read the books, and then they tell their friends, they tell their workers, they tell their family, "Hey, you really need to get this book." And that word of mouth sales, I'd much rather have that kind of best-selling, long sustaining book than, "Hey, I was a bestseller," and you can buy a bestseller, and people do that. Leif and I were talking to an individual the other day, and he was telling us about how he has a program and how he had set up the programs for, to make this guy a New York Times bestseller and this guy a New York Times bestseller. And we were kind of looked at each other because there's a price tag on it.
Of course. Right.
Yeah. So we were too dumb. We were too dumb to know that.
No, but listen, your books have impacted people in a lot of, and you could really see it in their faces when they're talking about the books, and it's really special. And it reminds me, I want to ask you about publishing this book, because I think that's a key part of the story of this actual book, which I want to ask you about. But it is, for me, just amazing to see the work that you guys have done. And in fact, Jocko, believe it or not, I was thinking about this today. When Leif and I were still dating, when I was still that girlfriend that you weren't that nice to the first time, You didn't know.
Hey,
You didn't know better.
What can I say?
You had met so many girlfriends before. You had no idea. Right. Okay. Anyways.
You were the only one.
Right. I was the only one he ever dated. But beyond that, you actually, Leif showed me something that you wrote for a ceremony. And that was part of the teens. And I remember reading it, and I looked at Leif. I said, Jocko can really write. He's a really good writer. And we talked about it. I really remember that time. So basically what I'm saying is I knew it all along. I could easily forecast his success. And, I'm owed a lot of credit for it. So that's basically what I'm saying. No, I'm not. Let me ask you about publishing this book. So you were told, you've mentioned this a few times online. I'm sure you've talked about it at some extent. But I want people to know, because I think it's an important part of the message of the book about facing fears or facing things that are obstacles. And so take us back. You had this idea for this book. You've published a bunch of books over the last couple of years. And basically you were told what by a publisher about this book, despite all your success?
Yeah, so I was actually negotiating 3 more books with my publisher. And to make a long story short, there were 2 kids' books and 1 adult book, and I was negotiating all of them. One of them was the Way of the Warrior Kid #3. One of them was a follow-up to the Discipline Equals Freedom Field Manual.
Which my mother loves, by the way. My mother loves the field manual. Just so you know. She's hardcore. I just want to tell you. But go ahead.
That is
Sorry.
awesome.
Yeah, she is.
And then this book, Mikey and the Dragons. And I had written Mikey and the Dragons at this point. And I wrote Mikey and the Dragons. I wrote half of it. One night I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I had the idea, and I went out and wrote it. And I wrote it all the way up until the story within a story. And then I was busy, and a week later I woke up at 3:30 in the morning and I wrote the rest of it. It probably took me 3 hours to write the whole thing. And I had written it, and I had talked to John, who did the art for Way of the Warrior Kid, and I said, hey, look, this is a much more detailed art book. And he's like, I'm in, we can make it happen. And so then I told my publisher, look, I really love this book, and I really, not only that I love it, but I just want to get it into the hands of kids, because I wish I would have had this book when I was 5 years old and 6 years old and 7 years old. So I just want to get this thing published by Christmas and get it to kids, for Christmas. And I did not think that was a big ask. These people publish millions of copies of books. And the answer came back, no, we can't do that. And I said, well, I understand it's a little rush, but can we just get it done, by Thanksgiving, and that way people can have it? And the answer was no.
And was there a reason for it? Was it just like, well, there's just too many books in the hopper, like we're not going to be able to print this? What?
There is a bunch of reasons, and I don't want to sound too harsh on the publisher. There are a ton of reasons. The reasons they have is, and the primary reason is they have a sales cycle that they work on, and they've got to take these books and they've got to get them into the stores, and they've got to pitch them to people, and they've got to get the stores to say, yep, we want to order some. And that cycle takes a really long time. It takes a year. And so they wanted to publish Mikey and the Dragons the following year. Like, it was 18 months away.
Got it.
And I'm thinking to myself, how am I going to sit on this story that is that I couldn't even contain it in my mind. I couldn't contain it. How am I going to contain it for another 18 months without talking about it, without telling people about it, without sharing the story with kids? And I said, look, I really want to get this thing published. I'm not worried about the sales cycle. I'm not worried about anything. I'll promote it. I'll be able to sell it. And they came back and said, there's no scenario where this book gets published by kids. And I was like, I gave them one more chance, and I said, are you sure? And they said yes, and I said, okay. And at this point, I had already thought about starting a publishing company primarily because I have people come on my podcast that have amazing stories, and I would want them to be able to tell their stories and want them to be able to get whatever they wrote published, which can be really hard with publishers because it's hard to get a book published.
100%.
And so I figured I was going to kind of at some point just start publishing books and having the people that come on my podcast, if they write something, I could just publish it and get it out there, and then people get to read what they wrote. So that was the idea that was in my head, and I'd kind of done some research and some background about it, and I had actually done the preliminary work of setting it up. So when they said to me, there's no scenario where this gets published by November, I kind of smiled to myself and said, okay, watch this. And I pulled the trigger on the publishing company, and I got it done. And so now the book comes out November 15th. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't aware of how many people were going to buy this book. And so right now I'm panicking, not panicking, but right now I'm as quickly as I can printing more copies because I didn't get enough run. And I've got multiple printers around America that are printing as many copies as they can, as quickly as they can. And it's a complex book. There's color. The binding, it's not just a quick print book. It's a very beautiful piece of art.
Yeah, it is pretty. I mean, tough, but pretty.
Yeah, I think I love it.
Now, so does that mean, Jocko, that I'm just showing everybody it? Does that mean that is it sold in every single bookstore? Is Amazon your primary way to do it when you self-publish, or how does that work?
It will go into other bookstores, but I have so many orders from Amazon that I have to go and just fill all the Amazon orders right now. Yeah. Yeah.
That's awesome. And I mean, it's not even out yet. People are going to be hearing this interview when it comes out. That's so.
Well, it'll be out then because it comes out tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Yeah.
Yeah. It comes out November 15th.
See, this is why I've orchestrated this way. You see how that works? It's good.
Brilliant.
Yeah. It's really good. Okay. Final question. I actually have to confront you about something. It's going to get a little uncomfortable. A couple weeks ago. Well, first of all, we should go back in time. Do you remember that conversation when you were like, Jenna, why do I need Instagram? Like, I don't want to do Instagram. Do you remember that conversation?
I remember conversations where I don't even need social media.
Yes, remember that? I actually distinctly remember it because it was during the time that Extreme Ownership was coming out, and you were living in our apartment for like 8-9 days, right? With my toddler right next door to you, which super comfortable and relaxing in a small New York City apartment. You didn't have Twitter. You didn't have Instagram. You did not want either of those things. And I was like, Jocko, I really think that this would be a really good idea. I wasn't the only one, but there were, yeah. And so now look at you, social media star. But a couple of weeks ago, we were talking, and I wanted your advice about a podcast, because I've started this new company, and I'm trying to figure out the way forward. And as an entrepreneur, there's so many different things that you do that you're trying out that don't work, that do work, and it's a lonely experience. And I'm in this whole new world after being in broadcast news, and I know some of it, but then I don't know others, and it's humbling on a regular basis. And I think humility is really great. There is a point when you get like, you wonder, do I need to be humbled anymore? Like, can I just like, no?
Humility turns into a straight beat down.
Yeah, I'm like, I feel humble, but maybe I need, but I'm still not at that point yet. The company's not even a year old, SmartHER News. So we were talking, and I was asking your advice about the podcast, and unbeknownst to you, a lot of stuff was happening at my house. I was trying to keep it on mute, but like, I was changing a dirty diaper. Trace came in, who's 4, who's potty trained, but had an accident in the backyard that I was trying to figure out. I had to put him in the bath. Like, all these things were happening while you were talking to me, and you were giving me you're giving me good advice, but it was very direct. You were like, I don't think this is the way you should do these things. I actually don't think this is the way you should start this. It was very direct, and it was important feedback for me at the time. But one of the things you said to me is like, Jenna, you have to get back in front of the camera. You need to do more. They need to see, your audience needs to see you. And I had all these reasons where I was like, I don't think I can do that. And so your idea was like, you should get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I don't know if you remember this. You're like, you should get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and you should record 4 1-minute videos. And that should be the news of the day. Like, that's going to be great. That's going to help build your audience. And remember, you're telling me this. You're not realizing that I'm changing these diapers and these kids, and my husband's away. And I'm like, there's no way that's even, like, that's the craziest idea. We hung up, and I totally burst into tears. I was like so frustrated, not because of you, but because it was just a series of things, and the solutions that was being given by you and others was like things I was like, I don't think I can do. I just don't think I can do it. And then you said to me something else really important. You said, you need to drop your standards. And I was like, Jocko, I can't drop my standards because it's the news. Like, it's not talking about something. I can't be wrong. I can't be like, oh, I'm sorry, the president didn't say that. Like, I have to be really specific. So I was arguing with you a little bit. I felt a constructive way. I don't think I was being a jerk, but you might feel differently. But based on that conversation, I really do have to thank you, because I was like, I can't do what Jocko's telling me to do. But what he said is totally right about dropping my standards a little bit. I had to figure out a way to do that in order to continue to create. And so based on our conversation, that's how I started to do our coffee talk on SmartHER News, which is like the only time in my entire day, being a stay-at-home mom, having 2 toddlers and a husband that travels all the time, that I know I can produce content is right after everyone gets up and before we walk out the door. And that's going to mean that I don't have my hair brushed, my teeth brushed, or any makeup on. But that's just going to be it. And like, that's the real me. And that's what's authentic. And the truth of the matter is that there's a lot of overproduction in news, and news isn't really good right now. And if I really want to be a source of something different, then I need to embrace being something different. And so that started the coffee talk segment that we do every day, but live on Instagram, and these little shorter segments that I'm able to publish across different social media. I'm still not as consistent as I'd like to be, but I'm trying. And that has really helped grow our audience. So I have to thank you for that.
Well, that's awesome. And I think there's actually a very cool metaphor there inside that story of the fact, and you were on network news, and I got to see you in that world. And you're right, the network news, there's a veneer painted across, literally painted over the faces of the people that deliver the news. And okay, I get it. There's such massive production. I mean, just the fact that the set isn't real. It's not a real thing. There's behind it is a big, piles of junk. And the dresses, people don't dress that way in real life. You don't walk around dressed like that. You don't put on that makeup to go out to grab a bite to eat. So there is a metaphor in the fact that there's this veneer put over the news, literally. But then what does that do to what the words that are coming out of people's mouths? And there's a metaphor in the fact that they're putting a veneer on what the news is as well. They're manipulating it, and they're changing it to make it look a certain way. And I think when you strip that away, and what you've done in stripping away this production level, and you're coming at it from a more raw place, a more real place, I think that means that the words that are coming out of your mouth are much more accurate, and you're not trying to make it look like something it isn't. You're trying to explain what's going on in the world, and I think a lot of people are looking for that right now.
Well, I appreciate that. And that's what I kind of came to the conclusion after our conversation. Like, if I love the news and the priority is the news, and I love the people, and that's the whole reason I became a journalist, was because I actually love helping people. And there's not a lot of ways in the world that I can do that, but this I'm good at. This I know. I know I can be a journalist. Like, this is something I know I can serve. And so that's where this all came from. And I was like, well, if that's the case, if I'm really true to myself, and I'm really true about what I'm saying, like, I'm not, this is real, then I just have to take that a step further. And you got to go a little bit further than I'm comfortable with. And ended up happening. So I would like it every once in a while. Maybe I should brush my hair a little bit more. Like,
but to add to the metaphor a little bit, when you read about Mikey and the dragons, yes. Here's a little prince that's afraid, and he's afraid of the unknown. And you were used to always being presented in a kind of picture perfect sort of way, and there had to be some sort of hesitation or fear in the back of your mind, thinking, well, if they see me without makeup, they might not think, they might see that I have freckles.
No, but here's what's funny about that, Jocko. The entire time that I was on the air, this was a constant battle for me, in that my makeup artist of many years is so great. I would only choose like 1 or 2 colors of lipstick. It was the same lipstick. It was always neutral. It was always the same thing, because I could not get myself to that place of I still had a lot of makeup on, but it never felt comfortable. It never was right. It never was exactly the right thing. I never looked at myself and thought, oh, I look really great, or like that looks really like me. I never felt that. I felt, I was part of a team, so I wanted to fit in with the team and be a contributing member of the team. That's how I looked at it, but not like, oh, that's it, and that's one of the reasons why I left. There's only so long you can divorce yourself from those things before they overtake you. And I could watch other people in the news, especially women, and quite frankly, as they would go longer in their careers, it could be very destructive. And that wasn't the only reason why I left. It wasn't because of the makeup. But there is a bigger point to it, and like I said, I didn't mean to be, joking, but it is true. Every once in a while I look at our coffee talk videos and I'm like, a little extra production would be great. Like a little hair brushing might be good, every once in a while. So there's a happy medium there, but it's going down the right path, and that's really important. So, and that was born out of our conversation. So thank you.
Yeah. And I just look at, for instance, my podcast, which has almost zero production. No theme song, no intro music, there's almost no editing. It's black and white. It's stripped away. I try and make it as stripped away as I can, because I just want people to see me for me, and for just, hey, there's no veneer here. This is just who I am, and that's the way it is. And I think that one of the reasons the podcast is popular is because of that. Is because when you contrast that with, hyper production and the veneer that people paint over themselves because they want to come across differently as who they are, I think that shows through. And I think that's why something like what you're doing will also start to rise, because people see that you're just you're a person, you put some effort into this, not in the effort of putting on a production together, but effort into actually know what you're talking about and be able to deliver good information. And that's infinitely more important than the way you look or the graphics that are popping on the screen behind you.
Yes, absolutely. So there we go. We're full circle, because there's a great message in this book about for kids and not making things bigger in their minds than they actually are, which is great. And I really love the story of the prince, and I really love that letter. And I think I can see that framed on a lot of walls in the future. So we're going to have, maybe that's another Jocko product that we can put together. But beyond that, even as an adult, I think that is a great takeaway, which is that there are so many times that you're trying to confront something, you're going into the unknown. And when you actually get there, like when I'm actually, for example, just doing coffee talk in my pajamas with my kids running around, it's not as scary and actually can be done. And that's how you can get to kind of the other side. And that's all we're all trying to do in life, is get to the other side of whatever is immediately in front of us. And so I think it's a really good message. It's too bad, but it's also not bad that someone told you that this book was not going to be out by Christmas. So congratulations. I think it's going to be another hit. And I appreciate it, Jocko. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on.